Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're reviewing Cable number one. So, we got a. I'm still a little behind on my pull list from this week because I have quite a few books to still review and just didn't really have the time to get through them as quickly as I normally do in the week, at least from what we've done so far out of these live reviews. But nevertheless, I'm working my way through it, and one of the issues I picked up was Cable. Now, Cable's two issues in, actually, but I just picked up number one for now because I kind of just wanted to check out the new series and see what it was all about. I happened to get this, the only copy that was available was the Scotty Young variant. Not that I'm complaining, it's pretty cool looking, and I do like Scotty Young as an artist. I quite enjoyed this particular cartoony drawing of Cable. It was fun and felt appropriate for this type of book. Good afternoon, Raphael. Thanks for joining us, along with Jaden and a bunch of other people. And yeah, so this book is by Jerry Duggan, who does a lot of different books for, well, I can just think of X-Force, but still, he does work within the X-Men line, and I really like X-Force as a series, so I was quite optimistic about this. Art is by Phil Noda, who's a legend, and oh, hello, Weeby and Geeky. What's it called? Joe Sabino did lettering. Tom Muller is always seems to be credited for design, and I said before I think that's the X-Men logo and some of the other fine details of the pages common to all the X-Men books. Overall, this was a pretty... So, the challenge of a book like this is, in the world of X-Men after House of X, there's all these different series coming out, and Hickman himself has talked about the debate of whether it's too many books and stuff like that. Personally, I think as long as we kind of ebb and flow with these books and not all of them are here indefinitely, that's just fine. Plus, House of X is so interesting and so full of different ideas and concepts that a lot of these series are exploring different aspects of different characters. Now, the choice to focus on Cable is an interesting one. It's been done before, obviously, but that was with the older Cable. Now we got the young one going around, and that's another challenge that we got going. Adrian, thanks for joining us as well. So, and I haven't exactly been sold on young Cable, like the way I have the old classic character. Euthanizing him, we'll say, oh, that has a weird connotation. Making him younger was an interesting choice, but done during a much rougher period of X-Men history where I don't know, that sort of thing didn't leave me nearly as excited. In the world of Krakoa, it is kind of interesting to have this younger Cable going on. Now, all that being said, Duggan does a great job at really selling me on this book, especially how he kind of like establishes this character without really overly advertising it. He just sort of outlines a fun character doing fun things, and that's enough to really get me going on this book. Raphael was saying they should throw out different X-Men comics and see what people like. It seems to be what they're doing, and, you know, not every series has to run, like, forever. I don't think Fallen Angels is going to be around, or maybe it already has been canceled and I didn't know about it. But, yeah, a series like Cable could run for however long I guess the sales drive it, and that would be okay. So, we open up with Logan and Cable fighting in this little gladiatorial arena the X-Men have set up on Krakoa. Cable actually wins in a moment that I felt was earned and a legitimate win. Cable is very powerful, and it's cool that that victory didn't just default to Wolverine. The way Cable won felt like, oh yeah, they just basically pinned him to the ground with his telekinesis. I don't know how Wolverine would beat that, and he didn't. We then get a really cool page where we get a whole list of every fight that's happened in this little gladiatorial arena. It's mentioned that Magic did something to basically disqualify her, and she's the only one who's ever broken some kind of rule in the arena that made them just throw out her fight immediately. I can only imagine what that was, but it's a great little detail. There's Nightcrawler and Blink were the only ties. That's a fun little joke. And just like interesting other little details. Callisto won 3 fights in a row against like Pyro, Fish, and Jumbo Carnation. Leech beat Artie. That makes sense given what Leech does. Adrian says, as long as they don't do a brand new #1 issue for every series every year. Yeah, that's fair. I think if they kept doing that for something like Cable and just started relaunching it over and over again, that would be a problem for Marvel. I think if the X Men line wants to launch a bunch of series on an ongoing basis, like Adrian just mentioned, the Longshot and Dazzler series, but there's so many things you can do. I was talking about this list of characters here, and a lot of them feel like, oh yeah, like Rogue's on here, Havoc is kind of part of Hellions, and a lot of those characters would be strong solo series. Jubilee, yeah, I could go on, and that's just what's like the names in front of me. So then we get into the series proper. Cable's off to like have some threesome. I just love that whole weird, well, we shouldn't even call it that weird, the sexually free aspect of modern X-Men, and that's interesting. I am all for it. They're like going off to this island and creating their own new society, so sure, they wouldn't necessarily curtail to sexual norms and stuff. Best example of that is the fun of the Summers house, which is very relevant here because Cable's got to contend with his dad and stuff. Cable runs into a little kid who's like trying to help this giant monster that he says is in pain. So Cable and Pixie, the mutant X-Men from way back in the day, basically take on this beast, and that gets into the whole thing from the X-Men Core series where Krakoa like merged with this monster island. So it's cool to see follow up from that stuff, which keeps happening in these side X-Men series, which is definitely clearly the plan of the overall idea of the core X-Men series, is just to establish these things, and that's where these side series make more sense. Adrian was saying they could start working on more diversified characters that are brand new. Also, I guess they are known as the X-Men for another reason. That's an interesting point. I feel like we get a range of characters we've never gotten in X-Men history before. Sure, they're bringing back old characters, but when have they ever all been together like in a society like this? In addition to all these kid characters, like a lot of new mutants have been introduced through all of this stuff. So I think that potential's there, because I think that was a criticism earlier, is that they were just rehashing old characters, but I don't necessarily think that's too wrong in a world where hundreds and hundreds of named mutant characters do exist. Like, that's not a terrible thing. There's a lot of room for character exploration with so many of these characters, because they haven't been around very long or very much and across all the X-Men series and histories. Anyways, Cable and Pixie are taking on this monster. Pixie basically grabs the kid, and clearly the kid can like communicate with these animals and stuff. But Pixie isn't really listening and just says, "Here's like a little pixie dust to kind of keep you happy." At which point, the greatest like part of this entire issue happens, because we see things from the kid's perspective where he's all drugged out, and the monster's all like happy and smiley, and Cable's like, "Here, have a present," and he throws what's clearly a grenade at the monster, and the grenade's like, "Thanks, but I didn't get you anything." And the kid's just laughing while they're having this fight, and they cut back to what's really happening, and Cable and Pixie are just battling a monster. Eventually Armor joins in. Those two are the ones Cable had the date with, so that's why they're all together, and she manages to save Cable from getting like stomped on by the monster, and they see that he does actually have something in his paw. After a great deal of effort, they're able to pull it out. It's actually like this giant sword thing, and the second Cable touches it, he gets this crazy flash of where the sword came from. And it goes into this whole thing where, like, okay, I'm going to kind of go through it because it's out of nowhere. And this gets into, like, oh, we're just introducing new worlds of content, like, from completely uncomparable to everything else. So the sword used to belong to a space knight named Morn, who wielded the light of Galador. He purged monsters across the galaxy and arrived on a primordial Earth. And his fight ended like all the others, where he got stomped on by the monster. The sword got stuck in the monster, and it says like the knight's last moments, he felt fear and relief. So it's an interesting sword with a history and this whole alien world to it. Raphael's saying maybe the MCU will see the sales of this X-Men comics and makes a roster out of what sells. That's a cool way of doing it. Adrian's saying, Raphael, I could see that. Yeah, what a company like Marvel or like Disney really would do for something like that when making the movies is they would probably use more focus groups and stuff like that, which has its flaws for sure. There's advantages over just going over raw comic book sales to that too, though. Mostly, and what Disney would really care about is they'd want to tap into kind of beyond the comic book audience. What I think the comics are good for is like, oh, think of a character like Miles, where it's like they created a Miles Morales character and he just kept selling books, kept selling books, kept being used in these interesting stories that also sold well. And it just became this commercial phenomenon to the extent that Miles has his own movie about him and he's going to have his own video game focused on him and all this other stuff. Uh, I think that's where the comics are valuable and like where sales and these side series can really benefit things. I've thought a lot about how House of X can be interpreted and adapted into X-Men shows and movies and stuff. And there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot to throw at people too. So it will be interesting to see how that stuff is adapted. I think the first taste of it we're going to see is in some random video game or animated series, more all ages oriented or just outright designed for kids, but they'll have you visit Krakoa for a level and interact with the mutants of this era and in this style, and that sounds pretty interesting, and that will give us like the footing for even more ambitious adaptations and stuff like that. Adrian's saying it would be funny to see Mickey Mouse with lightsaber claws and his xenomorph mouth coming out of his mouth. Yeah, they could all just merge that stuff together. It's problematic to say the least. The MCU tends to handle their content well, but Disney's track record with stuff like their mainline animated movies or Star Wars isn't as consistent. And the way they go about those movies, if you learn like the production, we don't have to get into all that, but like it's troubling. Anyways, so Cable wakes up from his vision of the Space Knight thing, which really it came out of nowhere, but it was like, oh god, there's so much content coming out of this first Cable book. So he's like, okay, like he's all for this sword. He thinks it's the coolest thing in the world, and he talks about how his older self was all into big guns and stuff, but he, the younger self, can be into big swords. And I like that little moment. Scott kind of emerges from the woods, and he's like, what did I tell you guys about going to the monster part of the island? And they're like, oh, we're sorry, but, they kind of move on and start talking about the sword. Like he shows his dad his sword. And this is a cool part of young Cable, is he can interact with Scott Summers, and it feels more like he's interacting with his father than anything that future Cable and old Cable could have done. Not that I dislike old Cable, but this book really had me thinking like, in a lot of ways we've moved past old Cable's character. I really feel like his character kind of came to a complete arc sometime around all that stuff with Hope Summers, and after that they were kind of treading water. So young Cable feels more focused and better than like post that Cable. I personally feel he certainly had his moments as a character after that, but it just felt unnecessary after his death before Avengers vs. X-Men. So then they cut to like this random museum out in space. Literally, they explicitly say it's like galaxies away. And this Galadorian armor, so the same armor from that crazy sword, activates. And these robots are like, oh, the blade's been found. And they realize that the stars have moved around in the sky. And it's been like probably eons since they've woken up. And they're like, okay, well, they say 3 millennia. And they're like, well, it doesn't matter. We will restore everything we want and nothing will stand in their way. And they just sort of take off into space. Meanwhile, we then cut to what is only defined as another time and another place. And it's like this hellscape with this crazy fire crab. And he gets horribly shot by old Cable, who says, you first. And he's got like some weird robot dog horse thing behind him. And that's how the first issue ends. In spite of, and that, like, so I'm telling you guys what I was thinking about, like how I was like, okay, well, this young Cable, this book really sold me on him. And I was thinking like, okay, we can kind of move on past old Cable. And then he shows up at the end of the book, which I'm not necessarily against because it really isn't clear what role that character is going to have in all of this. But on the whole, this was a really strong book that I liked a lot. Between Phil Noda's incredible artwork, which really has just nice expressive faces and action and that sort of thing. But where it really works is in the coloring that he does, where it's like what I'll call soft coloring, almost like a pastel or painted quality to it, but just really striking looks. Take this page right here where it just goes red for the single scene where Cable activates his powers. Um, that sort of coloring is done throughout this book, and it's really effective. It makes the sword look cool. It makes the moment where the monster gets all uh, like cartoony because of the kid's hallucination. He does such a great job with that and with conveying what's happening in just a single page. It's a very funny book, but also fun. Got some good action, and it sets up a new series in an interesting way. Like this sword thing's weird, but it's X-Men weird. Like it's appropriate for that, and feels similar to the sort of thing that would be introduced in the Claremont days, where we're just going out into space and throwing out random alien stuff and seeing what sticks. I like this book and would recommend it, and will probably check out number 2 as well, like next time I go into the comic book store. Um, Adrian is saying they might have mutant levels in the new Avengers game. Oh, for by Square. Yeah, I don't know about that. For those that don't know what that story is about, the whole idea is Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan, is bringing together the Avengers, who are all like, I don't know, disassembled for whatever reason, and just sort of forming a team, and then they're taking on, I don't actually know what they're fighting, but I could see the X-Men showing up, though I think I said this before, because maybe someone else brought it up. I don't think the timeline of it all matches up. They've been working on this game for like 4 or 5 years, so it's well before House of X, and probably even before Marvel had a real inkling of where they were going, like in that direction with House of X and that sort of thing. I'm sure Hickman and the X-Men office were working on that for a while, long before we got to see anything of House of X, but I don't think they were working on it that far back. And I don't think they would have insisted or been able to convince Square to like focus on future X-Men comic that might or might not be a hit. They wouldn't have known that it was like it's going to be this huge hit and stuff, where like the X-Men are really dominating sales and stuff in a way that I haven't seen in, well, okay, let's put it that way, I haven't seen. But I've only been watching the industry and sales and stuff since like 2012-ish, 8 or 9 years maybe. So I'm not like an expert on what things look like long ago in terms of X-Men sales. I could check, and maybe it might be worth looking up one day for a video or something like that. But yeah, nevertheless, this is still, I've said this before, but I maintain it. And it's worth saying because we've kind of gotten a bit of a range of X-Men comics in the last few weeks. With like, I really didn't like Giant Size Magneto, and based on the feedback I got from other people, I wasn't really wrong in that assertion. One of the Empire tie-ins was weaker than the others. Like they haven't, not every X-Men book's been amazing. We've kind of talked about like how Fallen Angels just wasn't that strong, which is a shame because I love those characters. Adrian was saying they do have Genosha before House of D, House of M, you mean? And Magneto has always been an Avengers enemy. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff they can do with that Avengers game. I don't know. There's also a possibility that it might be very Avengers focused and not going to feature a lot of their side characters, but like there's stuff that, especially like, it's important to remember, it wasn't that long ago Marvel didn't have what am I trying to say? The X-Men characters, the Fantastic Four, and even Spider-Man's in a weird spot, right? So Marvel still might be playing games with that. I assume now, like any game coming out in the future, Marvel's going to definitely take the brakes off of that. And it feels like they already have in a few games where they can introduce things quickly. But the turnaround on Avengers, like that Square game, which is going to be a big RPG, I assume, of some kind or something, that isn't like something you can just turn around in a year or so. That's been worked on for a long time and probably been heftily planned. Oh, I see what you're saying now, Adrian, and I I think it would be more likely to do more classic X-Men comics content, like having Magneto as an enemy or a boss or something, focusing on a setting like Genosha or Westchester, and maybe doing Krakoa later. I think Krakoa is the kind of thing that could easily be introduced in like a Lego game. And I know like that's not super exciting, but that's how we start getting in. Like that's how Miles came into this stuff. That's how Spider Gwen started getting adapted into more things. It's how you open things up a little bit. Is it in those easy games where you can put in content? They've already done stuff in some of the Marvel free to play games. I'm like that have they can put in Krakoa content or Krakoa themed characters and that sort of stuff quite easily because those kind of games are constantly being updated and infused with new content. Even then, it takes them a while. Like I used to play a Marvel Puzzle Quest game, and it took them a good long while to introduce Immortal Hulk, even though that series has been running for a while and has been a huge hit and stuff because, you know, games take a while to develop and playtest and all that stuff. Adrian says, where I think Disney messed up is having Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 for just the Nintendo Switch. Oh, you mean that game I have on the Nintendo Switch with all the DLC characters? And if I start up my Switch, don't do that. If I start up, oh, it's gonna make me update. It's running Ultimate Alliance on here. Okay, you can go ahead and update. It's not like I'm doing anything important right now. Do it. Do it. Yeah. Anyways, I like that game, but yes. Like if you go to the like online danger room or whatever of that game, it's pretty quiet usually from what I've played, but it's so fun. And if you like those old Ultimate Alliance games, which I really do, it's a perfect recreation of those with just like so many characters and cool stuff. And that's a good example of one where they clearly went all out with the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and stuff. Although I noticed a good chunk of that was in the DLC. So that kind of gets into what I was saying. Like Marvel's opened that gate up, but it takes a while for game developers to react or to be able to change things on the fly. I think we'd be lucky to get Wolverine. Let's put it that way. But yeah. Okay. I think we lost some viewers there. Not like a ton, but I'm going to assume we've reached the general end of things. Raphael's saying, currently listening while playing Monster Hunter. You know, funny thing about Monster Hunter, I played that on one stream a while back, and I did that in a fun mode of like, oh, I've never played this game, let's just go in fresh, no characters or any gimmicks otherwise for that stream. I haven't played it since. And no, nothing wrong with that game, but I just haven't touched it. To be honest, if we're talking about video games now, what I'm currently playing, and it's interesting that I got into this, is Final Fantasy 15. Speaking of Square, historically, not since like 8 or 9, I haven't really been into a Final Fantasy game. I own 12, but I barely played through it because I just couldn't get into it. But 15's pulled me in pretty nicely, and while it's been like a week or two since I've been able to play it, I've certainly enjoyed it. I really like the aesthetic of just being able to tell him, oh, Ignis, drive me across the country. I want to listen to old-timey like Final Fantasy music and just enjoy the landscape or hear characters talk and stuff. It's a fun game. It's won me over so far. I think I'm on like chapter 3, so not very far in yet, but what I have played I've really liked, and I've been doing a lot of side quests and random content in that game, which to me really speaks to like the kind of game where I can just indulge in it. Alright, so we have clearly gotten off topic of Cable, but like I said, I recommend it. It seems like a solid start to a solid new series. Next up, we're going to talk about another new X-Men series, and actually we're going to do 3 in a row. So the next time we're going to talk about, I picked up Wolverine number 3, but obviously we haven't talked about Wolverine number 1 and 2, so I'm going to go through all 3 issues. Because of that, we'll see if I have enough time to fit that stream in with today, because I have a window of time of sorts, so we'll see. But either way, that's coming up at some point soon, so stay tuned for that. And then we have a few more comics that I also pulled this week that we'll be talking about as well. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for joining me, Adrian, Raphael, everyone else that kind of chimed in earlier. We always appreciate your viewership and stuff, and I'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.